Okay. Well, you are calling in from all over. That makes this so much more fun. Okay. Welcome back, everyone, to Service Disrupted, our ongoing webinar series from the American Foreign Service Association. I am Nikki Gamer. I am the Communications Director from AFSA, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's conversation. Now, if you have been following us for some time, you know that we have been documenting the disruptions and attacks on the Foreign Service workforce since January of 2025. The layoffs at the State Department, the dismantling of USAID, the dismantling of Voice of America, the rollback of labor rights for federal employees, and the blatant disregard for the very people who make the government run. And it has been a lot. You can ask anyone at AFSA. It has been a lot, and it can get really, really heavy. And through it all, what we've tried to do here is document and bear witness, set the record straight about what has happened to this workforce and to the people in it. But this week is different because, as we all know, Saturday, we are coming up on a huge anniversary for our country, the 250th anniversary of the United States. And we felt it would be wrong to let this moment pass without stepping back from the chaos of the last year and asking a bigger question. Because for almost every one of these last 250 years, there has been an American standing somewhere far from home, whether that's in an embassy, a consulate, a field office, a war zone, delivering aid. They're negotiating, they're evacuating citizens, keeping lines open between nations that would rather not talk. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the Foreign Service. And the work of diplomacy is as old as this republic. So today, instead of focusing on what's been taken apart, we wanted to celebrate what has been built and the people who built it. And what better way to do that than with two Foreign Service officers turned podcasters who have committed to capturing the stories and sharing them with the world. And we are so excited that they are here with us. So first, we have Christopher Wurst. He is the producer and the host of a program, a podcast called Soft, Powerful Stories, which uses first-person narratives so beautifully to highlight soft power efforts around the world for the past 60 years. And not only that, not only has he become this incredible storyteller, he served more than 2 decades as a diplomat, primarily as a cultural and press attaché in 7 countries across 4 continents. Chris Wurst, thank you for joining us to share these stories. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be here.
All right. And now we have another Chris Saenger, who is close to us here at AFSA. He was a USAID Foreign Service officer from 2009 to 2025, serving mostly in Latin America and the Middle East. His final tour was in Washington, leading the agency's Ukraine desk. His USAID colleagues elected him to serve on AFSA's governing board, so that's how we know him. And his podcast is called It Was Never a Job, and he shares the stories of USAID staff and families and their lives and careers overseas. Chris Saenger, it is so great to see you again.
Thank you so much. I am delighted to be with you.
All right, the Chris and Chris. Chris and Chris, we're going to hear from for an hour. For all of you here who have joined us for this storytelling hour, we would love to hear your questions. What questions do you have for these podcasters, these FSOs? Put them into the chat. We're going to try to get to as many as possible. And without further ado, let us get started. And, you know, we're going to turn the tables on here for a second and hear just a little bit about you and how each of you came into the Foreign Service. So Chris W., let's start with you.
Thank you. So I was a teacher. I was teaching overseas in Johannesburg, South Africa. And the children that I was teaching were the children of diplomats who were working in the embassy in Pretoria. And so I started to get to know about the jobs that their parents did. I started accompanying them on weekend trips out into the townships, and I was fascinated by it. And parallel to that, I had always wanted a bucket list item for me was to pass the Foreign Service exam, not to join the Foreign Service, but to say that I passed the exam. So I sat in the Johannesburg. This is really takes you back with a pencil and just a proctor and did this Foreign Service test and passed. And the rest is history. I started doing things instead of just teaching them.
Yeah, I love that because so much about being a teacher is also storytelling, right? So it's like kind of an interesting through line that you've sort of carried to where you are now. Very cool. All right, Chris Saenger, over to you.
I did not hold a passport until I was 17 years old. It took me a while to leave our own beautiful country. And when I did, I studied abroad in college in Ecuador, and it was eye-opening to me in so many ways. And when I left that, I had the level of detail I had in my future ambitions was that I wanted to do number one, something international, and number two, some kind of service and helping and making the world a better place. And I could imagine a million ways that might happen. Eventually figured out that there was a thing, a field called international development, got a master's, worked for a while for the contractors that implemented USAID programs, and then applied to every overseas oriented job I could find, leaving grad school, and eventually was lucky really to send an application to USAID at a time when they were actually hiring, because that did not happen all that often over the last 20 or 30 years. And I was lucky that I got on board in 2009.
It's not uncommon, right, for Americans to not I didn't leave the US until I was probably 18 or 19. And then to see the entire world that is out there and what you can do to serve your country and be part of that is really just such an incredible journey to be able to take. So relatedly, how did you go from FSO to starting a podcast and wanting to get into telling the story and going back to so many Americans don't know what a foreign service person is or what they do. And so storytelling is just so important to that. So yeah, what made you turn the mic on? And Chris W., we'll start with you.
I was always doing public diplomacy work in the State Department, and the longer I was there, the more power I realized that storytelling had, and it was always trying to incorporate storytelling. My only one tour in Washington, D.C., like the ultimate hardship tour. I came back to be the senior advisor for innovation in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. And I really wanted to start a podcast. I really wanted to use storytelling to show the importance of international exchange programs around the world, both people who come to the United States and then people from the United States who go overseas and bring back their knowledge to the United States. But I also wanted to do it in such a way that didn't sound like a typical boring government podcast. And so my team and I created a program called 2233, and it sounds a heck of a lot like Soft, Powerful Stories. It was a formula where we just asked people to tell us the stories of impact of their trips. And so I had that in my toolkit. I had taught myself how to be a podcaster. And then in my retirement, as I was sitting back and watching the new administration come in and start, ripping things apart and, what this podcast or what your program has duly covered, I really wanted to do something. And I had contacts, I had a skill set, and I thought that I would use stories to start conveying the importance about what we've been doing overseas all these years, now 7 decades. So it was actually a kind of a logical transition.
And the importance of stories and just why are stories so important? Like you said you wanted to do something. Well, why stories? Why storytelling? And what power does that have, do you think?
I always used to tell people that you could sit around a boardroom table and you could give statistics or you could talk about programs that you were doing and people would kind of get it. And then a week later, they would forget it. But when you could tell them a powerful anecdote, they may listen, they may remember that anecdote for the rest of their lives. We are actually wired to receive stories. Our brains are wired to receive stories. But also for me, I think they create empathy. And I thought in this really polarizing time where so many people are talking at each other or arguing or saying, I'm right, you're wrong, it would be better to sort of listen to people. And there's no better way to listen to people than through their personal stories, where it's not about whether you're right or whether you're wrong, but just how do we live and how do we exist and how do we coexist with other human beings on other, challenging places around the world.
And I have to say, your interview with AFSA President John Dinkelman and Naj and I were talking about it. We were like, he really captured who this person is, and we've heard him interviewed so many times because we're comms people. And the way you're able to thread it with music and for his spirit and the humanity really came through. So I encourage everyone on here to go check that episode out in particular. It was a great episode. All your episodes are great. But Chris Saenger, over to you. You were at USAID. You experienced this dismantling firsthand, and then you turned and started this podcast in that wake. So just tell us about that whole process.
Yeah, so the place where I think I will start in answering that question is just by saying that the foreign service part of the USAID workforce, the whole agency was somewhere around 10,000 people. That includes all of the local national colleagues and all of the civil service colleagues who were based in the headquarters. The Foreign Service, we're here at the American Foreign Service Association. I was a Foreign Service officer. That was under 2,000 people. And we all knew each other, at least, one degree of separation. And I worked there for 17 years. And I think of it as living in a town of 2,000 people for 17 years. And one day that town is just scattered. And I missed these people. I just wanted proximity to them and to their stories. And that was really the reason why I wanted to start a podcast, honestly, was to have a reason to connect with these folks again. And I totally agree about storytelling. I think one of the things that I thought of when I was creating this was that it was like a memorial service. That what do you do when you lose someone you love is you gather with other people who knew them and you tell stories. You laugh, you cry, you maybe acknowledge that the person wasn't always the greatest, but that is the way that we heal, and that is what I wanted to do with this show.
Yeah, there is something that is so emotional about it, right? When there's podcasts, they're so intimate too. You really feel like you're sitting there with the person as they're kind of just telling you what happened. I want to, since this is about storytelling, I want to ask you I want you to tell a story. If you each can think about all of the episodes you've recorded and the people you've spoken to, if you want to just pick out one person that really struck you or someone that you just learned something new about, please go ahead. Chris Wurst, go ahead.
It's funny because I always, in my initial conversation with storytellers, they always say, well, what stories do you want me to tell? And I say, I don't know. I don't know your stories. But what do you keep going back to? And why do you keep going back to it? And what made an impact on you? And it might be something small and something very quiet, but it is a very powerful thing. And so I've been happily surprised time and time again, and just absolutely grateful for people willing to open themselves up and share, sometimes difficult, sometimes frustrating and intimate stories. Recently, I just ran an episode with Ambassador John Limbert, who was a Peace Corps volunteer in Iran and later a diplomat in Iran. He was one of the US hostages that was taken in 1979 and was held for 444 days. And we got into a really deep and personal conversation about his time as a hostage. And he was talking about how he used the rules of the culture in Iran and how he put himself in the role of a schoolmaster because that's what he had been in the Peace Corps, and that's how he dealt with his captors. And it was this really intense, really heartfelt, but so human episode where he was just, he didn't have hate, he didn't have bitterness. He had some bitterness about what's going on right now, but he didn't, from the time that you would think that he would be so angry, he really had this clear and really interesting take on things, very human take on things. And that really, I had to pinch myself when the interview was going on that we were able to share this and that I was able to then share that with the listening audience.
Yeah, there's something probably so thrilling about hearing that firsthand too. Like, an event that of such historic importance, and then just that people are able to recount that. And that's really powerful. Chris, over to you, Chris Saenger.
Yeah, the feeling that this community of people is having these amazing experiences and I'm part of it, even if these are not my stories per se, the fact that I am a member of the community and get to just be near it really meant so much to me when I was at AID, and something I wanted to capture. It's worth saying the format of my show is not here's this week's guest and I speak to one person in an interview style. If you haven't listened to it, there's a theme that I came to later. I had open-ended conversations with people, but you talk to enough people who work for USAID, and they all have great stories about visiting projects out in places that are far outside the capital city. They have great stories about the effects that their life had on their families, both with them at post and at home. So when you listen to an episode of my show, you'll hear 8 or 10 different voices who are speaking about a particular topic. But I'll cut across several of those and sharing a few of what are my favorite stories from folks. The colleague who spoke with such fascination about a trip that he took where he walked for 3 days through Nepal to go and visit earthquake housing projects, post-earthquake recovery, or the person who was I forget if it was Iraq or Afghanistan, I think it was Iraq, and there were just air alarms and rockets coming in all the time. And eventually you were supposed to get out of your bed, you're supposed to go to the shelter, but just became so exhausted and so tired that she just laid her armor-plated vest over her in bed and had just made her peace with the fact that it was her time. It was her time. I actually have an episode. I had a little bit of a hiatus, but there is a new episode today about USAID folks and their interactions with the military. And there's a guy who was posted in Conakry, Guinea, and was outside the capital when a coup happened, learned that there was a US Special Forces detachment in a Guinean military base nearby, and they had him drive over there in his family minivan to the base and then caravan back to the capital, to the embassy, with a special forces guy sitting in his shotgun seat, literally the shotgun seat, the front passenger seat of his car. So there are endless stories. I asked people all to reflect on times when they looked around and they thought, I cannot believe I get to be here in this place and do this work with these people. And some of those responses were focused on a place, the way it smelled, the way it looked, these beautiful areas outside the capital. But some of it was about the people they interacted with, being able to sit and really communicate deeply and then do something to help the local folks that they were interacting with. But if you'll indulge me for just one more minute, I think the one that I like the most right now, that I'll go just a little longer on, is the colleague who was in Nigeria and acquired a tuk-tuk, these little three-wheeled sort of a vehicle that carries lots of people and lots of goods in the crowded capital city in Abuja, and bought one of these, customized it with the doors that he liked and a sticker of a fireball on the side. It was a vehicle that needed license plates. He put diplomatic license plates on his tuk-tuk, which there is called a KK, and nicknamed it Fireball. And his description of the interactions that he had with other Nigerians in traffic, where they would see this this white guy, and they'd wave and they'd smile. It is just the kind of connection. He's being such a beautiful ambassador with a small a for the United States in that moment, where he's driving a sort of an ordinary vehicle, and he's part of the community, and he's waving and he's smiling. But the reason I think it really exemplifies what I loved about my life as a foreign service officer in USAID is it's an experience that you could never have if you were not a diplomat, if you weren't living there for a really long time. You could never visit for 2 weeks and know enough, be connected to enough people, have frankly, the confidence and the wherewithal to try this. And it just exemplifies the way that USAID folks and lots of other diplomats would have fun and do things that were unexpected, that were possible. It was this imagination that, like, I could do this and I'm going to go do it. And I love talking to folks and hearing those kinds of stories.
Gosh, you describe it so well. I'm almost there in Nigeria and looking at the tuk-tuk. Um, Chris Wurst, why do you think, Chris Saenger just talked so beautifully about, some of these folks who he's talked to. Why do you think these stories aren't more widely known or more widely understood? There's just such an image of like a State Department person as like a boring bureaucrat in a suit. Why don't we hear stories about this USAID guy and the tuk-tuk, or the person who was part of this in Iran hostage situation?
I think there's a couple of reasons, and it's too bad. I think we have not been great about telling our stories. I think sometimes we've not been allowed to tell our stories domestically. So people back home didn't automatically have a great knowledge of what was going on in our embassies or consulates overseas. But also, I don't think that we are well trained, or we were well trained to recognize these as the interesting and fascinating stories that they are, but also to tell them and how to tell them. So definitely, that's what I'm trying to do in the podcast. As Chris was speaking, I was thinking about people in these situations that are crazy and surreal, but also, the military example. These are brave people that are doing hard jobs, and they're in uncomfortable places, and they're away from their friends. And, the USAID folks are in suits, and the military guys are we have helmets and guns. And so, I keep coming back to, how do we relay that back to people, that the scope of the work, the depth of the work that's going on, but in a way that they will be able to empathize with. I think if you got into the daily life of what was happening in an embassy, people would fall asleep. They wouldn't be able to follow it. And so much of good diplomacy is stuff that never makes the headlines. That's because it was good diplomacy and things were resolved before becoming headlines. But I think that if you bring it back to the human side, which Chris does excellently in his podcast, and also I love the fact that he relies on kind of first person narrative and lets people describe their lives rather than explaining it to other people. I think it's something that people can relate to, but you have to present it in a way that they can connect to, or they can empathize with.
And relatedly, so with your podcast, and you're able to thread it so well, where you just feel like you're sitting there listening to someone talk to you. I mean, how long does it actually get, like peel back the curtain for a minute just on the process? Because I think sometimes when you're a listener, you're like, oh, this is, I'm just hearing this person narrate this story, where it actually takes a lot to put something like what you have together.
I reached out to somebody recently, and they listened to a podcast, and they said, "Oh no, I could never talk for a half an hour without prompts." And then I explained to them that no, it's actually a full interview. I just pull myself out when I can. I mean, my goal is for the listener to have a pure experience listening to the storyteller in their own voice. If I need to pop in as the narrator, if I need to, set some context or explain something, I will do that. But I think the trickiest part in what you described is just finding the story arc and finding a way to put it together from beginning until end. And I have a few tricks. I always start in people's childhood and ask them about growing up in the US, mainly in the US. Who were their heroes? Who were their role models? What did they want to do when they grew up? Things that anyone can relate to try to find like these moments of empathy before we go over and overseas into the more surreal or unknown areas. Because if you know someone and then you travel overseas with them as a Peace Corps volunteer or as a humanitarian worker or as a diplomat, I think then you're a little bit more receptive to their stories about what was happening. So that's how I try to do it.
Yeah, and probably the disarming too. Like once you sort of ground them in something that they're more comfortable talking about, then you can take them where you need to go. Chris, how about you? I know that, you know, being thrown into podcasting, with your USAID career, was there anything that you used from USAID to be able to do what you're doing now? Or are there any similar skills?
I think the sense that you could try something with a little planning and a little preparation. You're not going to eliminate all the risk, but you're going to have enough of a sense of where you want to go and enough confidence in yourself and in the colleagues around you that it might end up in a good place. Was enough to send me down the road. And again, like I talked about before, starting with this therapeutic desire for myself to have conversations. And I tried actually to have it not feel like an interview in the recording. I would find groups of three people. I would usually reach out to someone I knew well and thought would have a real that I would have a great time talking to, and ask them to identify a third person that maybe I didn't know, but was also a part of the little USAID Foreign Service community. And then the three of us had a conversation about anything and I did a little prompting and a little, like Chris was saying, a context injection from time to time, but letting people speak. And I tell stories too. I wanted to not just be a listener. My voice is in these shows and the wild things that happened to me and that I got to participate in are also very much part of it. The nicest compliment I've ever been given on this show is that somebody said it sounded like this was not a foreign service person, it was the family of somebody who was an FSO. That it
Mm.
sounds like I'm eavesdropping on a really smart group of people who had these amazing lives and they're kind and they're funny and it's so great to just kind of sit and listen. So you don't have to have been a practitioner to I think to feel a sense of connection to this work.
Is there any other story or anecdote that struck out to you or that blew your mind or surprised you as you were listening to this family recall their time in service?
Well, so this was somebody who was a member, I believe, of the extended family. This isn't somebody that I think this was relayed to me secondhand. A person who said, "Oh, my mom thinks this is great. She's like eavesdropping on foreign service officers," because it can be a little mystifying. It can be, I think people have a picture that never contains the full multitude of what the life is. You might imagine a USAID officer's life to be really full of deprivation and challenges, and you're living in some of the toughest places in the world. Sometimes that's true. It also, you might have this really romantic sense of it's always adventure and you're always discovering new places, and that's also true. You might imagine it as being just really hard, no matter where you're living, to pick up and move all the time. Again, also true. But I think giving people the sense that it was all of that all at the same time. It was it was this kind of swashbuckling life sometimes, but there was a lot of bureaucracy, and you also didn't get away from your inbox all that much. These kinds of appreciations of all the different facets of it, I think, is what sometimes the folks who are extended family members take away.
Yeah, it's certainly easy to just have that image of, yeah, someone out in in a place not a lot of Americans have ever been, and the whole idea of aid delivery is so outdated. You think, than how it happens now. Um, Chris Wurst, how about you? Is there any other stories or moments that just truly surprised you as you've been conducting these interviews?
I was talking to Jody Olson, the former director of the Peace Corps, and she, out of the blue, came out with an anecdote about these doctors in this Tunisian clinic that she was working in as a Peace Corps volunteer, filling condoms with water, and then having water balloon fights in the hospital. And I thought, okay, well, I have a script, but I'm going to stop, and we're gonna dive into that a little bit. Or I had a recent episode with a woman who said in passing that when she was young, she wanted to marry three men from three different countries and have a child by each of them so that she could have kind of these multicultural children. And I thought, well, let's press pause and explore your thinking a little bit. But I think for me, I'm always incredibly curious. And so when people throw these little tidbits out, I'm just really excited to grab them and see where they go. And I find a lot of the people I talk to are very humble and they think that they don't have great stories. And they're always saying, oh, what do I have to give? And then I find that they have these amazing stories. And so there's always a little bit of a disconnect there. But I think that anyone who's lived this lifestyle, as Chris was describing, with it, boring on the one hand and swashbuckling on the other, and I was thinking kind of like a Marx Brothers movie in my experience in several embassies. You are going to have good stories, and so sometimes I feel like it's just my job to help coax those stories out.
All right, we're going to go to the audience in a minute, but one more question for you before we turn it over to my colleague, Naja. Of all the conversations you've had on your shows, what is your honest answer to this question? What kind of person does this job? What kind of person becomes a foreign service officer based on all of your interviews? What would you say, Chris Saenger?
The people who do this job are people who believe that change actually is possible, but it's going to take a lot of work and it's going to take a long time and it's going to take a ton of sustained effort. It will not be easy. We will not overnight revolutionize these countries and communities. I think it's also a person who, like we were saying maybe a little bit before, loves adventure and has a tolerance for risk, but also does not go absolutely insane inside a bureaucracy where it takes a lot of memos to make anything happen. And program officers like me inflict a lot of process on you. Yeah, somebody who plans and thinks a lot, like I said, but is also comfortable improvising and doing what makes sense in the moment. I think people who worked for USAID derived a huge amount of dignity and meaning from their work, but they also, I mean, they moved their family across the world over and over again for this job. For as much as the title of my show is, it was never a job, it was also work sometimes. So we derived a lot of dignity and meaning from that employment, but then we also realized, and the folks who were on the show and tell stories knew that it was just work and there was a lot of fun to be had in the midst of the work that we did. And that kind of attitude, that way of moving through the world is something I just so deeply admire in my colleagues. And it's something that I want for myself and for my kids. Like I want them to be those kinds of people. And so having the chance to just marinate a little more in that kind of energy and those people was a treasure to me. And I hope it comes through when folks listen.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the commitment to public service and the wanting to do good, wanting to do better. And anyone who knows Randy Chester, who is our board vice president, knows that that is true. He is, he is that. He embodies that.
Shouts to Randy Chester
Shout out to
and
Randy
AFSA.
Chester.
All of you guys at AFSA have really meant a lot to us in aid over these last 18 months. But Randy Chester,
Look up
let's
that.
throw that guy a parade
Let's throw that
on
guy.
July 4th.
Chris Wurst, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, all of those things. I interview people who were Peace Corps volunteers, diplomats, folks who were doing, various types of development work, humanitarian work, and it's interesting how much they dovetail together. And one of the things that I would say is they are highly competent, which is something that I always really, really appreciate. It sometimes blows me away what people are able to achieve in the conditions, given the circumstances in which they have to achieve it. I find the people to be very proud, to be very service oriented. And many of the people that I talk to carry that back with them to the United States. One of the things I always talk about is the value to people in America. So we're overseas doing things, we're helping people, we're conducting diplomacy, but people here in the United States should never lose sight of the fact that that benefits them. It improves our security, it improves our health, it improves our prosperity, and all of those different things. So I think all of that is very important to people. But yes, they're idealistic, they believe in what they do, but they've lived through enough to be pretty pragmatic as well. So yeah, always. I always, it doesn't matter if you're a Peace Corps volunteer who was only 2 years in country and then came back to the United States for 40 years, or if you were a career diplomat for 30 years, there are always similarities. Good listening skills, the idea that local is better. How do we achieve sustainability? I mean, all of these things are just really kind of deeply a place in the people that I talk to.
Oh yeah, the competency and the ability to do. I mean, I didn't know many FSOs before I started this job, but since I've been at AFSA, remarkable just in terms of attention to detail and how smart they're all so good at Jeopardy. You all know everything. I swear, never play someone in a trivia game who is an FSO. That I have firsthand knowledge on. And yeah, just so much respect for all of people who become FSOs and ability to pass the FSO test, which you did, and that is a credit unto itself. Okay, I'm going to pass this over to Naja Ruzika, my colleague, and she is going to field some audience questions. Naja, over to you.
Thank you. I have loved listening to today's discussion. Like Nikki said, it has been a long slog of bad stories that we've been sharing with everyone. So this has been such a balm for the soul. I'm loving it, and I hope you are too. Okay, so we've gotten a bunch of questions both in the registration and during today's discussion. So I'm going to go through most of them. I want to start with the one posed, since we just gave Randy, our favorite USAider, a big shout out. I want to start with a question that Randy asked. I think I'll start with Chris Saenger. But have you thought, or are you planning, where are you now episode? What are we doing to continue our mission? Chris Saenger, over to you.
Thank you. Well, and so first of all, just for anybody who is not already a member of the Randy Chester Fan Club, he is the vice president on the AFSA governing board. He was elected by the workforce at USAID to be their primary representative at AFSA and has been there since 2023, carrying that mantle. He's on TV. He's really like sending letters and pressing all the time inside the administration and the government for things that AFSA thinks are important. So all you guys do that at AFSA, but that's why we are so grateful to Randy. I have thought about the idea of where are they now. It is a change. So far, the show has been very backward looking. It's been reminiscing, it's been remembering, it's been that, like I said, sort of a memorial service energy, maybe, or at least that's where I started in my imagination. It's not to say that the episodes are joyless and heavy. They're quite the opposite. But a forward-looking, where have folks landed? How are they continuing? It is something I have thought about, and we'll see. I know where to find you, Randy.
Yeah, I think you will have a lot to share there because from what we're seeing, USAID folks are running for Congress. They're doing all kinds of amazing things still in service to others. So whenever you're ready for that episode, we can't wait to hear it. Chris Wurst, what about you? Any thoughts on a similar type of episode?
I am fascinated with this idea of what people did a year and a half ago when all this was starting to happen. And, a lot of people, really suffered. They lost their job. They saw their colleagues fired. But a lot of people put their frustration into action. Chris started a podcast. A number of people have started podcasts. People wrote books. Into the Wood Chipper and Nick Enrich has been all over the media. People are very hungry to hear about the story. Organizations have popped up that are trying to further the cause. And so I'm fascinated with this movement, this kind of grassroots movement that's really, people are not rolling over and saying, okay, well, that's too bad, let's move on. I think people, the same passion that I talked about, how they believe in the work that they're doing, they're now bringing to, how do we achieve next steps? How do we get back to, it's not going to look the same, but what can we build to? How can we continue to think about improving development in the future? So I do try to explore that when I talk to people that are relevant in that space.
Great. I'm going to stay with you for this next question. It's a bit of a logistics question. It's for both of you, but I'll stay with you. How do you select your interviewees slash stories? And do you also, I think the answer is yes, but do you go beyond kind of the state USAID space? Do you go to other agencies like Foreign Commercial Service, Foreign Ag Service?
I'm open to any, because the premise is that positive U.S. engagement in the world is vitally important. And so anybody who has a piece of that, I'm open to talk to and, excited to. I would love to expand the programs to cover as many organizations as possible, to cover as many countries and as many, decades as possible as well. So I really try to consider diversity. I try to balance my episodes out between Peace Corps volunteers and diplomats and people who are working in humanitarian work and where in the world were they working and when were they working. And there's, so many factors, but that's how I do it. I have conversations with everyone and we kind of walk through potential stories. I'm really interested in very quirky, very kind of human stories. And so I always encourage people. But sometimes people just write to me out of the blue and said, I have a great story and I've been wanting to tell it for 20 years. And some of those stories have already appeared on my episodes. So and my biggest Achilles heel is that I can't say no to a good story. So, I have enough material to keep this thing going for years and years and years at this point. If that answers your question.
Absolutely. And so where you said people write to you. So we do have a couple of people in the audience who have expressed a desire to maybe be on your interview list. So where would people contact you if they're interested in sharing their stories?
On my website, softpowerfulstories.org or softpowerfulstories@gmail. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. And we'll drop that in the chat for folks. Chris Saenger, over to you. How do you decide on your stories and who to talk to? And if someone is interested in being on your pod, how would they go about it?
The tagline of my podcast is that it is a show about life overseas with USAID. So I am looking for folks who based their life and their career outside the United States, American diplomats. I have heard from folks who worked for the agency based in the States, traveled a ton, contributed immensely to the results that we got. I've heard also from folks who were local national colleagues, people who were contractors, people who are, and I have not expanded the four walls of the show to include those other experiences. And it's not out of any kind of chauvinism about hiring category or agency or anything at all, but it's just because, again, my little tribe that I feel like I'm a part of and that I'm speaking for is that aid foreign service. And I do have a little tag at the end of each of my episodes that Soft Powerful Stories is another place to go and learn more about programs and about other people who did this work. A shout out also to a colleague, a former USAIDer named Leah Petit, who has a great show called Global Development Interrupted. Everybody should check out Global Development Interrupted. But I also say in each one of my episodes that if you are a USAID alum or a family member who has a story to share, I would love to hear your story. So you can go to my website, itwasneverajob.com, and there is a contact form. Hit me up. And if you are a person who lived their life overseas with USAID, let's talk.
Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit to what I find to be a perennially difficult question for us. We've touched on it. How do we break beyond our circles, beyond the Beltway, beyond the wonks, beyond the people who are sort of in this very narrow space of people who understand the Foreign Service? How do we get to them with these important stories, which illuminate why the Foreign Service is important, which illuminate why an agency like USAID was important? We've covered it. We have not done the best job, I say we as all of us in this space, of telling the story of why this is important, and maybe that contributed to the dismantling of USAID. But given what's happening now, there is a renewed urgency to tell these stories. So how do we think about how we get to kind of beyond that choir? Chris, I know you've done a lot of Chris W. I know you've done a lot of thinking on this, so I would love to hear from you.
It's a really hard question. It's the $1,000,000 question.
The $1,000,000 question, yes.
I think when I was in the State Department, I was always frustrated because I felt that we had a tendency to play it very safe oftentimes, that we try to put together formulaic good news. Everything had to be good news and we lost a little authenticity, I sometimes thought, when we only relied on just polishing these really kind of rote stories about good things happened in this village and good things happened. And so I think they need to be authentic. I purposely, my ideal audience person is someone who is in middle America, quote unquote, middle America, who doesn't think a lot about what goes on overseas, or they have misguided notions about what goes on overseas. And I try to communicate to them in a way that they maybe will understand or receive the information a little bit better. I'm lucky because my program is also on Pacifica Radio Network. So it's available to over 200 community radio stations across the United States. And some of these are dinky little, like you drive 5 blocks and you lose the reception, but they're really important, I think, to reach people in these places. The other thing I would say, and I agree with Chris completely about Global Development Interrupted, it's a great show, is that we do better when we support each other. And so to the extent that we can help each other amplify the work that we have, to the extent that we can promote work that's being done by other people that's all kind of a piece about why this is so important, I think that that's vitally important. We all have our own voices, and so together it's much better. But I do think we sometimes need to get over this fear factor we have about just speaking out. And that's been really refreshing to me, to see Dink come out so strongly and so honestly and so passionately for the work that AFSA is doing, because it really is not a time to worry about every little word. Sometimes emotions speak louder than those carefully constructed words.
Yeah, agreed. Chris Saenger, I know that obviously your podcast started more as a catharsis and a way to heal and stay connected with your community, but is this something that you think about, kind of how to reach the folks beyond our choir with the stories of USAID?
I I think I tried to follow the advice you hear people sometimes give to entrepreneurs or storytellers of various kind build the thing that you want, the thing that you need, the service you're going to use, the piece of software you're going to use, the story that you really, really want to tell. And the odds are good that if that is burning inside of you and it will bubble out in a way that attracts other people. And because it is authentic and true, people can sniff that out even if it's not their bubble. So that was the starting point. And if it has the impact of connecting with other people, and I know that it has. I think, if I'm honest, most of the people who are listening to this show are themselves USAID alums or the family of USAID alums. But it's through that family connection where I know people have sent it and said, this is a pretty good picture of what my life was actually like. If you wondered what we were doing out there in between our home leave every few years when we saw you or when you came and visited for a couple of weeks, this is it. And I have had that experience with folks who I knew from my hometown in high school a million years ago who I didn't keep in touch with, but I've listened and I understand. So I do think it has you throw the rock in the pond and the ripples spread outward, but I'm not trying intentionally to reach those folks. And hopefully the fact that it is story-based, back to the idea that Chris W. was saying earlier, that stories can bring people in a way that a show about how to think about the conflict in Iran or migration policy or something like that just doesn't reach people quite as much. I am hoping that starting from this place that is more based in feelings than in policy might give it some legs outside of our echo chamber.
Yeah. And I think that that's something that's human oriented, right? And I think you're right. We expand those concentric circles by sharing with families, with communities. And if a story is compelling, I think it's got much longer legs. But obviously this is something that AFSA thinks about all the time. How do we reach more and more people with this story? And so podcasts like this are very helpful to kind of pull that curtain back. We've got just a few minutes left. I want to leave the audience with some wise words from both of you. And, every time we have one of these webinars, we get asked, well, what can we do to help? What can we do to spread the word? What can we do to help the Foreign Service or help our colleagues? So this question is along those lines. So for folks who don't necessarily have access to a podcast, to a microphone, what can they do to help illuminate some of these stories or illuminate some of the work to support the Foreign Service or to combat the negative rhetoric, especially around foreign aid that we have seen in the last year and a half? Chris Saenger, I want to start with you.
I will start by saying you probably have access to a microphone. Everyone has access to a microphone if you carry a phone around in your pocket. So feel free. I am living proof that you do not need a high degree of technical acuity to start a podcast. It's actually not that hard or expensive at all. So that's number one. Number two, in terms of how to help, I think I would love it if you sent my show to somebody, but I was thinking about storytelling and imagining maybe a slightly different question where it's like, well, what if I have stories to tell? How do I get my story out there? And I think the answer to that is to listen to other people. Ask someone else for their story. Ask a person whose world is different than yours in some way for their version of whatever the story is that you want to tell. And once you have opened the door to their version of the story that you want to tell, now that you're listening to them, they will be much more likely to listen to you. I think starting by asking someone who you see the world differently from for a story is a good starting point, as opposed to, I don't know, retweeting something from AFSA. Ask folks to, do that too, but connect with somebody in this emotional storytelling way and take it from there.
Thanks. Chris W., what about you? What would you sort of recommend to folks who either want to be an ally, help spread the word, or who themselves want to tell a story?
Well, I love what Chris just said. It made me want to interview him for some powerful stories to kind of hit that core emotional thing. I have this piece at the end of every one of my episodes, and it's dubious Aunt Deb. And I put someone across the Thanksgiving table from an aunt who they love and they want to continue to have a nice relationship with, but who sees the world in a completely different way. And then based on their answer to my question, I reverse engineer it and have this friend of mine who lives in Minnesota record these like real icy kind of comments from dubious Aunt Deb. And the whole point is, how do we push back? How do we articulate ourselves? How do we put our anger and our passion and all these different things in such a way that we can communicate with people in a civil manner, that we can have conversations and push those conversations to the next level. And so, whether it's a person that you're standing in line with in the store or a person that you're riding the bus with or whatever the case is, that all builds on itself. And so that's what I would say. And of course, to help amplify the voices and the stories and the news articles that you see that really hit a nerve with you. I think it's important for those things to get out there and to be heard and to be seen and to make the rounds.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. We are almost at time, and I do want to make sure I give Nikki some time to close us out. So thank you again, both. And thanks to the audience for those excellent questions. And over to Nikki.
Dubious Aunt Deb. I feel like we all need to go through that exercise with dubious Aunt Deb. Okay. So thank you everyone so much for joining us. Really appreciate you coming on to hear from AFSA, to hear from our guests. And thank you, Chris and Chris. I highly encourage everyone on here to check out their podcasts. And you should check out the chat where we have put links to where you can find those podcasts. So speaking of stories, we just wanted to give a little plug on July. As some of you know, July 11th marks a year since the layoffs at the State Department, the purge. And on July 16th, AFSA with AFG, the Civil Service Union, we are going to commemorate the anniversary with an exhibit we're calling the Missing Badge. And that's going to happen on Capitol Hill. We're going to have a press conference. And the whole idea is to show versus tell, through storytelling what has been lost with our State Department colleagues who have been recklessly riffed and purged, and also with the demise of USAID, thinking about the crises we are seeing right now with energy security, Ebola, all of those things. So July 16th, if you are in the DC area, please do come out for that, 9:30 a.m. On the 16th. And you can email us gamer@afsa.org if you want to find out more about that and how you can support that. Thank you everyone for being a part. Chris and Chris, thank you so much for joining. And we cannot wait to hear more of your stories. Okay, from all of us at AFSA, bye everyone. Have a great 4th of July.